A security guard kicks a woman out of the mall thinking she's just trouble. But what he doesn't know? She owns the entire place, and by the time he finds out, things are already way out of his control. How far will she let this go before flipping the script on him? Hold on. If you could time travel, would you visit the past or the future? Why? The afternoon sun casts long shadows over the mall entrance, where a steady flow of shoppers moves in and out, their conversations blending into a low hum. In the middle of the crowd, a black woman approaches dressed in casual clothes, just jeans and a hoodie. She walks with an easy stride, blending into the sea of people. Today isn't an ordinary day for her, though no one else would know it just by looking. Her steps are deliberate, filled with a quiet sense of purpose. She looks up at the mall sign and takes in a breath, as if absorbing the moment. This mall, a place she visited countless times in her youth, now belongs to her. It was the culmination of hard work, sacrifice, and relentless ambition, her dream, finally realized. As she nears the main doors, a tall security guard named Richard catches sight of her. Richard, who's worked at the mall for years, takes pride in maintaining order. He's a man who sees the world in strict lines, who belongs and who doesn't, and has made it his personal mission to enforce those lines. Something about the woman catches his attention, though he can't explain why. Maybe it's her relaxed demeanor, or the way she walks with quiet confidence, or maybe it's something deeper, something unspoken, a bias lurking in his mind. Whatever it is, Richard's guard goes up immediately. He steps forward, his eyes narrowing as he studies her. Just as she reaches the door, Richard steps into her path. His expression hardens, the corners of his mouth tugging into a frown. "Where do you think you're going?" he asks, his voice laced with suspicion. The woman glances up, confused but calm. "Inside," she replies simply. Richard folds his arms across his chest, blocking her way. "Not today. We don't need any trouble around here." She pauses, momentarily taken aback. "Trouble?" she repeats, her voice steady, though disbelief flickers across her face. "I'm just here to—" Richard cuts her off with a dismissive wave. "I've seen it before," he says. "You people hanging around, stirring things up. Not on my watch." The woman takes a breath, her expression tightening, but she keeps her composure. She's dealt with men like Richard before. Men who judge before they know, who assume the worst based on nothing more than appearance. But today, she isn't in the mood to explain herself. "Look, I don't want any trouble," she says evenly. "I'm just going inside, that's all." Richard steps closer, his stance wide, radiating authority. "Not happening. Either you leave now, or I'll have to escort you out." For a moment, the woman says nothing, weighing her options. She could walk away, she could avoid the confrontation altogether. But not today. Not after everything she's worked for. She meets his gaze, her voice unwavering. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" Richard scoffs, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Doesn't matter, you're not going in." The tension thickens. Shoppers slow their pace, curious but silent, watching from the sidelines. No one steps forward to help. No one questions the guard. It's just the two of them now, standing face to face. "I'm giving you one last chance to leave quietly," Richard says, leaning in, his tone low and condescending. The woman doesn't move, doesn't flinch. Instead, she smiles, a small, knowing smile. "You'll regret this," she whispers. Richard, impatient, grabs her arm. "Come on, let's not make a scene," he mutters, pulling her gently toward the exit. The woman doesn't resist, not yet. As he leads her toward the doors, she glances around, taking in the familiar space that now belongs to her. Richard has no idea who she is or the mistake he's making, but he's about to find out. The mall stood as a monument to opportunity, filled with familiar sights and sounds. Bright storefronts, families browsing, and the hum of casual conversations. For most people, it was just a place to shop. But for Monica Davis, it was much more than that. The mall represented a personal victory, a culmination of her hard work, sacrifices, and relentless determination. It was more than just a property in her portfolio. It was a symbol of how far she had come. Monica had grown up not far from here. As a child, she used to walk these very halls with her mother, their footsteps echoing through stores they could only dream of affording. Her mother had worked tirelessly to keep them afloat, doing long shifts as a cashier, often coming home with aching feet and a weary smile. Those memories stayed with Monica, shaping her understanding of the world. It was a world that rarely gave without taking something in return. From an early age, Monica knew she wanted something different. Watching her mother struggle lit a fire in her, a deep desire to escape the cycle of just scraping by. But dreaming wasn't enough. Life taught Monica that success wouldn't come easily. No one was going to hand her a better life. If she wanted more, she would have to work for it, and fight for it. Her first taste of independence came when she opened a small clothing boutique. It wasn't glamorous. She rented a modest storefront in a neighborhood just beginning to recover from economic hardship. Monica spent long days behind the counter, balancing the books at night, and running marketing campaigns on social media to draw in customers. At first, nothing went smoothly. Suppliers doubted her, skeptical of working with someone without a proven track record. Some banks refused her loan applications outright, hinting that she didn't seem like the type to make it. But Monica pushed through every rejection with unyielding determination. She found smaller, independent suppliers willing to take a chance. She reinvested every cent she made back into the business, even when it meant going without. It wasn't long before her boutique became popular. What started as one store expanded to 2, then 3. Monica's eye for fashion and business acumen set her apart. Her shops attracted a loyal following, and soon she was managing a small but thriving brand. But even as her business grew, Monica faced constant obstacles. Competitors tried to squeeze her out. Landlords hiked rent prices. Investors questioned her ability to scale, often suggesting she find someone more experienced to run things. And yet Monica kept proving them wrong. Every setback only fueled her ambition. Then came the opportunity that would change everything. The chance to purchase the mall she had once wandered as a little girl. At first, it seemed impossible. The mall had fallen on hard times. Foot traffic was low, tenants were leaving, and it was losing relevance in the community. Bigger developers had already walked away, deeming it a lost cause. But Monica saw something in that struggling mall, a place brimming with potential. She imagined filling it with local businesses, hosting community events, and creating a vibrant, inclusive space that reflected the diversity of the neighborhood. The idea of owning the mall wasn't just about financial gain, it was about giving back to the place that shaped her. After months of negotiations, Monica closed the deal. It was one of the proudest moments of her life. She had beaten the odds yet again, turning what seemed like an impossible dream into a reality. Now, the mall and its future was hers to shape. But not everyone welcomed the change. Richard Miller, the head of mall security, was one of those people. Richard had been working at the mall for over a decade, and in that time, he had developed a sense of ownership over the place, though it was ownership only in his mind. He saw himself as the gatekeeper, someone responsible for keeping things in order and making sure the wrong kind of people stayed out. Richard prided himself on knowing what trouble looked like, or at least what he thought trouble looked like. In his mind, he wasn't a racist. No, he told himself, he was just good at reading people. He claimed to have a sixth sense for spotting problems before they started. But over the years, his instincts had become biased, shaped by his own prejudices and assumptions. He had seen the mall change around him. More diverse crowds, new stores that catered to different tastes, events that attracted people from all walks of life. To Richard, those changes felt like an intrusion, as if the place he knew was slipping away from him. He didn't say it out loud, but deep down, he resented it. The email announcing Monica's ownership hadn't meant much to him. He skimmed it, dismissing it as just another corporate reshuffling. He never imagined the new owner would show up in person, let alone today, dressed casually with no indication of her status. To Richard, She was just another young woman in a hoodie, someone he could ignore, dismiss, or push out if needed. And so, when he saw Monica walking toward the mall entrance that afternoon, he didn't recognize her. He didn't see a successful entrepreneur, a self-made businesswoman, or the person who now signed his paycheck. All he saw was someone who didn't look like they belonged. Richard's assumptions about who belonged and who didn't had gone unchecked for years. It wasn't conscious, at least not in a way he acknowledged, but it was always there, lurking beneath the surface. And today, those assumptions would cost him dearly. As Monica approached the glass doors, Richard's gaze hardened. He stepped forward, his hand already rising to block her path, as if she were a problem that needed solving. Monica wasn't expecting trouble today. Not like this. She had spent years fighting her way to the top, overcoming more obstacles than she could count. But even with all her success, moments like these still stung. They were a reminder that no matter how far she had come, there were always people like Richard waiting to judge her by the color of her skin, by the way she dressed, by the assumptions they made before knowing anything about her. For a brief moment, Monica considered telling him the truth right then and there, revealing that she owned the place he thought he was protecting. But something stopped her. She wanted to see how far he'd go. It wasn't the first time Monica had encountered people like Richard, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But this time, things would end differently. Because today, Richard Miller wasn't just dealing with a woman in a hoodie. He was dealing with the owner of the entire mall. And he was about to find out. The air outside the mall felt thick with tension as Richard stood squarely in front of Monica, blocking her path. A small crowd had started to gather, curious about the unfolding confrontation. Some shoppers slowed their pace, watching from the corners of their eyes, while others paused entirely, pretending to browse near the entrance to eavesdrop. Monica kept her expression neutral, but inside, frustration simmered. She'd been here before, treated like she didn't belong, dismissed, underestimated. But this was different. Today, she wasn't just another woman trying to prove herself in a world that expected her to fail. Today, she was here to step into her rightful place as the owner of this entire mall. And yet, here she was, being told she had no place at all. Richard's stance was firm, arms crossed over his chest. His eyes narrowed with suspicion, as if her very presence offended him. "Like I said," he repeated, his voice low and condescending, "you need to leave." Monica met his gaze steadily. "I'm not going anywhere," she replied. Her voice was calm, but each word carried a weight that made Richard shift uneasily. "You got somewhere else to be," Richard muttered. "This isn't a playground and we don't need trouble." Several shoppers cast glances in their direction, some shaking their heads in silent disapproval, others simply watching the scene unfold with mild curiosity. But no one stepped in. No one questioned what was happening. Monica took a slow breath, forcing herself to remain composed. "I'm not causing trouble," she said evenly. "I'm just here to do my business like everyone else." Richard chuckled, the sound dripping with sarcasm. "Your business?" He shook his head. "Look, I've seen this before. People like you hanging around, looking to stir things up. I won't have it, not here." Monica's jaw tightened at the thinly veiled insult. "People like me?" she repeated, her voice quiet but pointed. Richard gave a dismissive wave, as if she were a problem he wanted to sweep away. "You know what I mean. Don't act like you don't." Monica's hands clenched at her sides, the frustration building inside her, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She knew what he was doing, trying to bait her into anger, trying to make her the villain of the scene. And she wouldn't play that role, no matter how hard he pushed. "This is your last chance," Richard warned, his voice dropping into a sharper tone. "Leave now, or I'll have to remove you myself." Monica's pulse quickened, but she kept her gaze locked on his. "You really think I don't belong here, don't you?" she asked quietly. Richard scoffed. "I don't think—" "I know. Now move along." She took a step closer, standing toe-to-toe with him. "I'm giving you a chance to rethink this," she said. Her tone wasn't threatening, but it carried a quiet authority that made Richard blink, momentarily thrown off balance. He recovered quickly, his expression hardening again. "I don't need to rethink anything," he shot back. "You either leave on your own, or I make you leave." For a moment, the two of them stood frozen, locked in a silent battle of wills. The world around them seemed to pause. Shoppers stopped in their tracks, whispers faded, and even the air felt heavy with anticipation. Then, Richard made his move. Without another word, he reached out, his hand clamping around Monica's arm. It wasn't a harsh grip, but it was firm enough to send a message. "You don't belong here, and I'm in charge." Monica didn't resist. Not yet. She allowed him to pull her a step closer to the door, her expression calm, though her heart pounded with a mix of anger and disbelief. She knew she could end this right now. She could say the words that would bring this confrontation to a screeching halt, but she wasn't ready to play that card. Not yet. Richard, oblivious to the growing tension beneath her composed exterior, leaned in slightly. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be," he muttered, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "It's best if you just leave quietly." Monica smiled then, a small, knowing smile that carried more meaning than Richard could comprehend. "You're going to regret this," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Richard smirked, mistaking her quiet resolve for surrender. "Not likely," he muttered as he began guiding her toward the exit, his grip still firm on her arm. The crowd watched in silence, a few murmurs passing between onlookers. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting on their feet. But no one stepped forward. No one questioned what they were seeing. To them, it was just another mall security guard dealing with another problem. But Monica wasn't just another problem, and Richard was about to find out the hard way. As they reached the door, Monica glanced around one last time, taking in the familiar sights of the mall she now owned. She saw the stores she had plans to fill with local businesses, the food court she wanted to transform into a vibrant community space, the empty storefronts she intended to revive. This place, her place, was full of possibilities, and today, Richard had no idea that he was escorting out the very person who had the power to change everything. She let him guide her out the door without resistance, her expression serene. The revelation could wait just a little longer. For now, she wanted to see how far he would go. Richard opened the door and motioned for her to leave. "There," he said, his tone smug. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" Monica stepped outside, turning to face him one last time before the door closed. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her silence was louder than any protest. As the glass door swung shut behind her, she allowed herself a small smile. The game had just begun, and Richard had no idea what was coming next. This was far from over. Richard stood at the entrance, arms crossed with a self-satisfied smirk. He glanced around, pleased with himself for handling the situation. Another troublemaker dealt with, another day's work done. The shoppers who had gathered began to drift back into the mall, most of them avoiding Monica's gaze as they passed. Their silence spoke volumes. No one wanted to get involved. But Monica remained outside, standing still, her expression calm but thoughtful. She could feel the burn of humiliation under her skin, even though she refused to let it show. It wasn't just the public spectacle Richard had made of her, though that stung deeply. It was the familiar ache of knowing that no matter how far she had come, someone would always try to put her back in her place. Inside, Richard gave a satisfied nod to a passing employee, exchanging a look that made it clear he felt vindicated. As far as he was concerned, order had been restored. The uncomfortable energy of the scene began to settle, but not entirely. The shoppers who had witnessed the confrontation still whispered among themselves, casting glances toward the entrance, unsure whether they had seen justice or injustice unfold. Meanwhile, Monica slowly turned on her heel, walking toward the bench just outside the doors. She sat down deliberately, her eyes calm but focused, as if she were making a silent decision. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, not because of what had happened, but because of what it represented. Another reminder that, even at the top, she could still be made to feel small. But not today. As the minutes ticked by, Richard kept glancing toward the entrance, his earlier confidence starting to waver. Monica hadn't left. She was still sitting there calmly, as if she had all the time in the world. The sight unnerved him. Something about her presence, so steady, so patient, was unsettling. He muttered under his breath, "She'll leave soon enough." But she didn't. Shoppers continued to pass in and out, some giving her sympathetic looks, others pretending not to notice her at all. Inside the mall, the usual hustle of the day resumed. Families browsing, teenagers chatting, and employees busy at their posts. Yet, something had shifted in the air. Richard began pacing at the entrance, throwing occasional glances in Monica's direction. His smugness began to wear thin, replaced by irritation. "What's she waiting for?" he whispered to himself, shaking his head. After a few more minutes, his frustration got the better of him. He pushed the glass door open and walked briskly toward her. Monica looked up calmly, meeting his gaze with the same unshakable expression she'd worn throughout the entire ordeal. "You can't just sit here," Richard said, his tone sharper than before. "You've been asked to leave." Monica tilted her head slightly as if she were studying him. "I'm not causing any trouble," she said simply. "I'm just sitting." Richard clenched his jaw, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching too closely. "Don't make me ask you again," he said. "You don't belong here and you know it." Those words, "You don't belong here," hung in the air, heavier than they had before. Monica's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, just slightly. She straightened her back as if anchoring herself more firmly in place. "I told you," she said softly. "I have every right to be here." Richard rolled his eyes, his patience wearing thin. "You've got about 10 seconds to move," he warned, "or I'll call for backup." Monica folded her hands in her lap, perfectly composed. "Go ahead," she said. "Call them." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Richard's face. He wasn't used to people standing their ground. Most of the time, they left before things escalated. They didn't challenge him. They didn't hold their ground the way Monica did now, calm and unflinching. The doubt turned to irritation, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, lady, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but it's not going to work. If you won't leave on your own, I'll remove you myself." Monica gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Try it," she said quietly. Richard clenched his fists, his face reddening with frustration. He couldn't back down now. Not in front of the other shoppers, not after everything he had already said and done. If he let her win this standoff, it would look like weakness, and Richard wasn't about to let that happen. He stepped forward again, reaching out to grab her arm, just as he had done earlier. But this time, Monica didn't move. She stayed perfectly still, her gaze locked onto his with a steady, knowing look that sent a chill through him. "Go ahead," she said softly, her voice unwavering. "Let everyone see." The challenge in her words was subtle but powerful. For the first time, Richard hesitated. He glanced around, realizing that more people were now watching. Shoppers had begun to gather again, their murmurs growing louder as they sensed something important happening. Richard felt a bead of sweat trickle down the back of his neck. The situation was slipping out of his control. He knew he should stop. He knew somewhere deep down that this was about more than just a misunderstanding. But the weight of his own pride, his need to assert authority, clouded his judgment. He grabbed her arm again, this time more forcefully, and began to pull her up from the bench. Monica rose slowly, her expression unreadable. She didn't fight him, but she didn't cooperate either. It was a quiet act of defiance. A refusal to give him the satisfaction of winning. The whispers among the crowd grew louder. A few people pulled out their phones, recording the scene as it unfolded. Eyes were everywhere now, watching Richard's every move. He could feel the weight of those eyes, watching, judging, waiting to see what he would do next. And for the first time, Richard felt exposed. Monica, standing tall beside him, leaned in just slightly, her voice low but clear. "This is the moment," she said softly. "The one you're going to regret." Richard's grip loosened for just a second, but it was enough. Monica gently pulled her arm away, stepping back without breaking eye contact. "Watch yourself," he muttered, his voice shaky now, barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. "This isn't over." Monica gave him one last look, a look that carried the weight of everything she had been through, everything she had overcome. And then, without another word, she turned and walked calmly toward the mall entrance. The crowd parted for her as she passed, silent and watchful, their phones still raised, recording every step. Richard stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, a sinking feeling settling deep in his gut. Something told him he had just made a terrible mistake. And soon, he would learn exactly how big that mistake was. Monica stepped back inside the mall, her footsteps steady and deliberate. The familiar hum of shoppers surrounded her again, but this time the air carried a different energy, a tension that followed her like a shadow. Richard remained frozen near the entrance, watching her with narrowed eyes, the weight of the confrontation still lingering between them. He couldn't believe she'd come back inside. No one defied him like that, not after he'd given them a warning. His jaw clenched as she disappeared into the crowd, and he followed, weaving through the shoppers. He wasn't done with her. Not yet. Monica made her way deeper into the mall, her gaze sweeping across the storefronts. She walked with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was and what she was doing. She stopped near an empty space that had once been home to a department store, looking thoughtfully at the vacant windows. Richard caught up to her, irritation bubbling over. He planted himself beside her, drawing curious glances from passers-by. "I thought I told you to leave," he said, his voice low but sharp. Monica glanced at him, her expression cool. "You did," she replied evenly. "And I decided not to." Richard's hands balled into fists at his sides. "You don't get to make that decision. You're not in charge here." Monica turned to face him fully, her gaze unwavering. "That's where you're wrong," she said softly. Something about her tone, calm, measured but carrying an edge of authority, sent a chill down Richard's spine. He forced a laugh, but it came out hollow. "I don't know who you think you are, but this isn't your playground. I suggest you leave before you cause more problems for yourself." Monica smiled then, a small knowing smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You really have no idea, do you?" Richard folded his arms, his frustration mounting. "What I know is that people like you come in here thinking the rules don't apply to them." Monica's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what exactly do you mean by people like me, Richard?" Her voice was calm, but the question carried weight, an unspoken challenge that hung between them. Richard faltered for a moment, caught off guard by how easily she'd turned his words against him, but he recovered quickly, his pride refusing to let him back down. "I mean, people who don't belong," he said, his voice stiff and defensive. Monica gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if weighing his words carefully. "Well, I do belong here, Richard," she said, her tone steady. "In fact, I belong more than anyone else." Richard snorted. "Yeah, right." Monica tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You should really pay more attention to those emails you ignore," she said softly. Richard blinked, confused. "What the hell are you talking about?" Monica reached into her bag and pulled out a folded document. She unfolded it slowly, deliberately, as if giving him one last chance to piece things together before it hit him. "This," she said, holding up the papers, "is the ownership contract for this mall. My name's on every page." Richard stared at the document, the color draining from his face. His brain scrambled to make sense of the words she had just spoken, but they didn't compute. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his throat suddenly dry. "You," he stammered, the words sticking in his throat. "You own the mall?" Monica folded the papers neatly and slipped them back into her bag. "That's right," she said, her voice cool and steady. "I own the mall, every store, Every hallway, even that door you tried to push me through. The weight of her words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. For a moment he stood frozen, his mind racing to process what had just happened. The woman he had humiliated, the person he had dismissed so easily. She was the boss. She was the one in charge. A wave of panic surged through him. His mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. He knew what could come next. Complaints filed, HR involved, the threat of losing his job. His stomach churned as he realized just how badly he had miscalculated. Monica gave him a moment to let it all sink in, her expression calm but firm. "Now, Richard," she said quietly, "do you still think I don't belong here?" He swallowed hard, his mouth dry. I didn't," he stuttered, searching for words that refused to come. The certainty, the smugness, the authority he'd wielded so easily before, it all evaporated in an instant, leaving him exposed and powerless. Monica watched him, her gaze steady, waiting to see what he would do next. She wasn't angry, at least not visibly, but there was a quiet strength in her presence that made it clear she wasn't looking for an apology. She was looking for accountability. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. Richard shifted on his feet, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him like a stone. Finally, Monica gave a small, deliberate nod as if to say, "I'll give you this moment to think. But it won't last forever." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Richard standing in stunned silence, his mind spinning with the realization of what he had done. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Richard stood rooted to the spot, his face pale, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman he had insulted, humiliated, and forcibly removed had turned out to be the owner of the entire mall. A sinking feeling settled in his gut as the enormity of his mistake dawned on him. This wasn't just a bad decision, this was career-ending. He needed to fix this. Fast. Richard hurried after Monica, weaving through the crowd. His nerves were shot, and the usual confidence he wore like armor had crumbled. He found her near the center of the mall, looking over an empty retail space. She stood quietly, hands in her pockets as if contemplating the future of the place she now owned. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "Miss Davis, Monica." His voice faltered, and he hated how small he suddenly felt. Can we talk?" Monica turned slowly, her expression unreadable. She regarded him for a moment, as if deciding whether he was even worth the effort. "Talk about what?" she asked calmly. Richard shifted on his feet, the weight of guilt settling heavily on his shoulders. "Look, I didn't realize who you were," he mumbled, his words stumbling over each other. "If I had known..." Monica's sharp gaze cut him off. "If you had known," she repeated, her voice dangerously soft. "Would that have changed the way you treated me?" Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. What could he say? She had cornered him with a simple question, one that left no room for excuses. Monica took a step closer, her voice still calm but heavy with meaning. "If I were just another shopper, if I weren't the owner, would you have treated me with the same disrespect? Or was it because of what I looked like? Because I didn't fit your idea of who belongs here?" Richard swallowed hard, shame washing over him in waves. "It's not like that," he whispered, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow. Monica raised an eyebrow, her expression cool. "Then tell me, Richard," she said. "What exactly is it like?" His mind scrambled for something, anything, that would explain his behavior. But every excuse that came to mind felt cheap, insincere. There was no way out. He had to confront the truth, as uncomfortable as it was. I don't know," he muttered finally, his voice barely audible. I guess I didn't think." Monica's expression didn't change. She crossed her arms, waiting for him to continue, giving him the space to unravel under the weight of his own realization. "I've been here a long time," Richard admitted quietly. "I thought I knew who was trouble and who wasn't, I thought I was keeping them all safe. Monica's gaze didn't waver. Safe from who? She asked softly. People like me? Richard's throat tightened. He knew the answer, but he couldn't bring himself to say it aloud. Monica's voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the gravity of her words. You judged me before I even opened my mouth, she said. And it wasn't because I looked dangerous. It was because I looked different. The truth in her words stung more than Richard had expected. He felt exposed, as if someone had stripped away the layers of denial he had built around himself over the years. He had always told himself that he wasn't racist, that his decisions were based on instincts and experience, not prejudice. But now, standing in front of Monica, he could no longer hide behind those lies. I'm sorry, Richard whispered, his voice breaking slightly. I was wrong. Monica studied him for a moment longer, her expression unreadable. Do you know how many times I've heard that apology? She asked quietly. How many times someone has told me they didn't mean it, that they were just doing their job? Richard's shoulders slumped, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a lead blanket. He had no defense. The truth was laid bare between them, and there was no way to make it right, not with words anyway. I really am sorry, he stammered, though the words felt small and useless. Monica gave a slow nod, as if acknowledging the apology but not accepting it. Not yet. It's not just me, Richard, she said. How many others have you treated like this? How many times have you made someone feel like they don't belong, just because of how they look? Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no answer came. The truth was, he didn't know. Monica let the silence stretch between them, her expression calm but firm. You've spent years thinking you were protecting this place, she said. But all you were doing was keeping people out, people who had just as much right to be here as anyone else. Richard's heart sank. The realization hit him hard. All the times he thought he was doing the right thing, he was really just pushing people away. People like Monica. She gave him a long, measured look, her eyes filled not with anger but with something more difficult to face. Disappointment. I don't need your apology, Monica said finally. What I need is for you to understand, because if you don't, nothing will change. Richard nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. I get it, he whispered. I do. Monica studied him for a moment longer, as if trying to decide whether she believed him. Finally, she gave a small nod. Good, she said, because things are going to change, and if you can't keep up, you won't have a place here. Richard swallowed hard, knowing the warning was clear. This wasn't just a lecture, this was a choice. He could either change or be left behind. Monica turned to walk away, leaving Richard standing in the middle of the mall, his thoughts swirling with guilt and shame. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He watched her go, feeling smaller than he ever had before. And for the first time, he realized that the hardest part wasn't facing her. It was facing himself. As Monica disappeared into the crowd, Richard knew that this was his moment of reckoning. Whether he would rise to the challenge or crumble under the weight of his own prejudices was a question only he could answer. And the clock was ticking. The rest of the day dragged on with Richard pacing anxiously near the mall entrance, his thoughts in disarray. Shoppers passed by, some glancing at him curiously, others ignoring him altogether. But all Richard could think about was how badly he had messed up. He knew Monica could easily have him fired, and if she did, there was no way to undo the damage. Hours later, just as the crowd began to thin, Richard got the call he had dreaded. His radio crackled with a familiar voice, his supervisor. Richard, we need you in the management office, now. The walk to the office felt like a death march. His pulse thudded in his ears as he imagined what was coming. Monica had every right to report him, and no matter what he said in his defense, there was no excuse for what he had done. When he reached the office door, he took a deep breath before pushing it open. Inside, Monica sat calmly across the table, waiting. Next to her sat the mall's general manager, arms folded and eyes heavy with disappointment. Richard swallowed hard, his palms clammy as he took a seat across from them. The manager cleared his throat, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Richard," he began, "we've been informed about the incident today. Miss Davis has explained everything." Richard glanced at Monica, who met his gaze with a calm expression, neither angry nor forgiving. She sat with the quiet authority of someone fully in control, not just of the situation, but of herself. It unnerved him more than any shouting ever could. The manager continued, "Monica has decided not to file a formal complaint or request your immediate termination." Relief surged through Richard, but it was short-lived as the manager added, "However, there are conditions." Richard nodded quickly, desperate to salvage what little dignity he had left. "Anything," he whispered. "I'll do whatever it takes." Monica leaned forward slightly, her voice calm and measured. "You'll issue a public apology," she said. "Today." Richard's heart sank. A public apology. Not just a private conversation, but an admission of his actions in front of the very people who had witnessed his behavior. His stomach churned at the thought. He wasn't used to being vulnerable, especially not in public. But he knew there was no room to argue. If he wanted to keep his job, if he wanted any chance at redemption, he had to do this. The manager gave him a stern look. "Miss Davis is being generous, Richard. You should take this opportunity." Richard nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I understand," he muttered. Monica stood gracefully, smoothing her jacket. "I'll meet you at the food court in 15 minutes, she said simply, and with that she left the room without another word. The walk to the food court felt like a blur. Richard's mind raced as he tried to prepare himself for what was to come. When he arrived, Monica was already there, standing near the central fountain with a small group of onlookers gathering around her. Richard's heart sank further. People had heard about the incident, and they were curious. Monica nodded toward him as he approached. "Whenever you're ready," she said. Richard took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. He stepped forward and faced the small but growing crowd. His pulse pounded in his ears, and for a moment he thought his voice might fail him. But then he looked at Monica, her calm presence, her quiet strength, and something inside him shifted. He knew this apology couldn't be half-hearted. It had to mean something. "I want to apologize," Richard began, his voice low but steady. "Earlier today, I made a terrible mistake. I misjudged someone, our mall's owner, Miss Davis. I treated her unfairly and with disrespect. And for that, I am truly sorry." The crowd murmured, a few people exchanging glances. Richard could feel their eyes on him, their judgment heavy in the air. But he forced himself to keep going. "I assumed things about her that weren't true," he admitted. "I let my biases cloud my judgment, and that's not the kind of person I want to be." He paused, glancing at Monica, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was enough to help him continue. "I know words aren't enough," Richard said. "I have a lot of work to do to make this right. I need to change how I see people, how I treat people. And I will." The silence that followed was thick and heavy, filled with the weight of the moment. Richard felt exposed, raw in a way he never had before. But somehow, it also felt right. Like this was the first step towards something better. Monica stepped forward then, standing beside him. She addressed the crowd with a calm but firm voice. "This isn't just about one apology," she said. "It's about creating a space where everyone feels welcome, where no one is judged for how they look or where they come from." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with those gathered around. Some nodded in agreement, others simply listened, absorbing the weight of her message. "We all have a part to play in making this place better," Monica continued. "That starts with accountability. acknowledging our mistakes and learning from them. Richard stood quietly beside her, feeling the truth of her words settle into his chest. This was more than just a moment of public embarrassment. This was a chance to change. As Monica finished speaking, the crowd began to disperse, some offering her nods of respect, others giving Richard quick, cautious glances. The atmosphere felt lighter somehow, as if something heavy had been lifted from the air. Richard turned to Monica, his voice low. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me a chance." Monica gave him a small, measured nod. "This isn't about me giving you a chance," she replied. "It's about what you do with it." And with that, she walked away, leaving Richard standing alone by the fountain, the sounds of the mall returning to their usual hum around him. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt something unfamiliar, a sense of hope, fragile but real. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't let this moment go to waste. He had been given a chance, not just to keep his job, but to become better, and now it was up to him to make it count. The following day, the mall bustled with its usual energy, but things felt different. There was a shift in the air, a sense that change was on the horizon. Monica had made it clear that the mall's purpose would go beyond retail. It would become a space that reflected the diversity and heart of the community it served, and she was wasting no time in making that vision a reality. Monica called a meeting with her management team and store owners to outline her new direction. Sitting at the head of the long conference table, she spoke with calm authority, her words precise and thoughtful. "I don't just want this mall to be a place where people shop," she began. "I want it to be a place where people feel they belong, where small businesses can thrive, and where the community comes together." The room was quiet, all eyes on her. Some of the managers exchanged glances, unsure how to respond to this shift in focus. They were used to thinking in terms of foot traffic and sales numbers, not community engagement and inclusivity. Monica leaned forward slightly, her gaze sweeping across the room. "This isn't just about improving the mall," she continued. "It's about creating opportunities for minority-owned businesses, local artists, and entrepreneurs who don't always get a fair shot." One of the managers cleared his throat, hesitating before speaking. "It's an ambitious plan," he admitted, "but it's going to take time, and there are risks." Monica nodded. "I understand that, but I'm not interested in playing it safe. I've spent my whole life taking risks, and I didn't come this far to stop now." There was a quiet determination in her voice that silenced any further objections. Over the next few weeks, Monica's plans began to take shape. She reached out to local business owners, offering them discounted rent for pop-up shops. She invited artists from the community to display their work in the common areas, turning the mall into a vibrant gallery of creativity. She also partnered with nonprofit organizations to host community events, from weekend farmers markets to cultural festivals. The food court, once filled with the usual fast food chains, began to feature stalls from local vendors, offering everything from homemade pastries to authentic street food. As Monica walked the mall's corridors each day, she could feel the transformation unfolding. Spaces that had once been empty and lifeless now buzzed with activity and energy. People lingered longer, not just to shop, but to connect with the art, the food, and each other. But Monica's efforts didn't stop at creating opportunities for businesses. She was equally committed to changing the mall's culture, starting with the people who worked there. She implemented mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, from the security team to store employees. Richard attended every session, sitting quietly at the back of the room, absorbing the lessons. At first, he felt awkward and out of place, unsure if he belonged in these conversations. But as the discussions unfolded, something inside him began to shift. He listened to stories from his colleagues, stories of discrimination, of feeling unseen or unwelcome. And for the first time, Richard realized how deeply his actions had been rooted in assumptions and biases he hadn't even recognized. The training sessions challenged him to rethink everything he thought he knew about the people around him. One afternoon, after a particularly eye-opening session, Richard approached Monica. She was reviewing some documents near the central atrium, her focus sharp as always. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Miss Davis," he began, his voice low. "I just wanted to say thank you for giving me a chance to be part of this." Monica looked up, her expression calm but thoughtful. "It's not about the chance, Richard," she said gently. "It's about what you do with it." Richard nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. He knew there was still a lot of work to be done, both within himself and within the mall. But he was ready to take on the challenge. Over the next few months, Richard threw himself into the work with quiet determination. He volunteered for community events, helped local vendors set up their stalls, and even assisted with some of the mall's outreach programs. The more he engaged with the community, the more his perspective shifted. He began to see the mall not just as a place to enforce rules, but as a space where people could feel welcome and safe. And with each small act of kindness, each effort to connect with someone new, Richard felt himself growing, changing. Monica watched his progress from a distance, never interfering but always aware. She wasn't looking for perfection, just progress. And Richard was proving that he was willing to grow. One day, while Monica was reviewing proposals from new tenants, Richard approached her again. This time there was no awkwardness in his demeanor. He stood tall, his posture relaxed but respectful. "I've been thinking," Richard said, "about everything, and I wanted to apologize again, not just for what I did to you, but for all the times I've judged people unfairly. I know I can't change the past, but I'm trying to do better." Monica regarded him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she gave him a small nod. "I can see that, Richard," she said, "and that's what matters." It wasn't an absolution, it was a recognition of his effort. And in that moment, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. As the mall continued to grow and evolve, so did the people within it. Monica's vision was becoming a reality, a place where everyone was welcome, where differences were celebrated, and where the community thrived. And through it all, Monica remained at the helm, quietly steering the ship with the same strength and determination that had carried her through every challenge in her life. This wasn't just a mall anymore. It was a reflection of everything she believed in. And as Richard walked the halls each day, greeting shoppers and helping wherever he could, he knew he was part of something much bigger than himself. This was his second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. Months passed, and Richard's transformation slowly took root. Day by day, the rigid authority he once wore like armor gave way to something softer: humility. He no longer viewed his job as merely enforcing rules, but saw it as an opportunity to serve the people who walked through the mall's doors. But redemption, Richard soon realized, wasn't a single act or moment. It was a process, a series of choices, small but meaningful, that he would have to make again and again. One afternoon, Monica was meeting with a new vendor in the food court when she noticed Richard helping a young woman set up her stall. The vendor was a local baker, nervous about her first day, fumbling with her equipment. Richard knelt beside her, patiently adjusting the table legs, offering her reassuring words. "You'll do great," he said with a small smile. "Just take it one customer at a time." Monica watched quietly from a distance, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It wasn't just the action that struck her. It was the ease with which Richard did it, without any need for recognition. Later that day, as the mall began to wind down, Richard approached Monica near the atrium. There was no hesitation in his step this time. He had something he needed to say. "Miss Davis," he began, meeting her gaze with quiet resolve. "I wanted to thank you again. Not just for giving me a chance, but for showing me that I needed to change." Monica tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "You've been doing good work, Richard," she acknowledged. "But I'm curious, what made you decide to keep trying?" Richard exhaled slowly, as if the answer had been sitting heavy on his chest. "Because for the first time, I saw things differently," he said. I realized how many people I had pushed away without even meaning to. And I don't want to be that person anymore. Monica gave a slow, deliberate nod. Change isn't easy, she said. But it's worth it. Richard hesitated for a moment, then took a breath. I know I can't undo what I did to you, he admitted, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I want you to know that I'm committed to being better. There was no grand apology, no dramatic plea for forgiveness, just an honest acknowledgement of the journey he was on. Monica studied him for a moment, then offered a small, understanding smile. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, Richard, she said gently. It's about recognizing the effort someone makes to grow, and I can see that effort in you. Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders, not because the journey was over, but because he knew he was on the right path. A few days later, Monica invited Richard to sit in on one of the mall's community meetings. At first, he wasn't sure if he belonged there. The room was filled with local business owners, community leaders, and nonprofit representatives, all working together to plan the mall's next event, a cultural festival that would celebrate the diversity of the neighborhood. But as the discussion unfolded, Richard realized something important. He wasn't just an observer, he was part of this community now. He listened carefully, offering input when asked, learning from the perspectives around him. When the meeting ended, Monica pulled him aside. I invited you because I believe you have something to contribute, she said. You understand this place in ways others might not. Richard nodded, grateful for the opportunity. Thank you, he said simply. Monica gave him a small, knowing smile. Keep doing the work, she said. That's what matters. And with that, she left him standing there, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. For the first time in his career, Richard wasn't just enforcing rules, he was helping to build something meaningful. He had found a new sense of purpose, not through power or authority, but through service and connection. And though he knew there would still be challenges ahead, Richard felt ready to face them. Because he wasn't just a security guard anymore. He was someone who belonged. The day of the grand reopening arrived, and the mall buzzed with life and excitement. Bright banners hung from the ceilings, colorful balloons swayed in the air, and a stage had been set up near the atrium for the day's festivities. The newly renovated spaces gleamed with fresh paint, and the storefronts were filled with local businesses, each offering something unique, a reflection of the vibrant community Monica had envisioned. Vendors lined the walkways, their displays inviting and creative. Food stalls filled the air with delicious smells, aromatic spices, sizzling street food, and freshly baked treats that drew eager crowds. Live music played softly from the stage, adding a festive rhythm to the celebration. Families strolled through the corridors, children tugging their parents toward the colorful displays, and visitors mingled freely, enjoying the event. For Monica, this moment was surreal. She stood at the edge of the atrium, watching everything unfold. This was more than just the reopening of a mall. It was the realization of a dream, one that had started years ago, when she was just a little girl walking these same halls with her mother, dreaming of a better future. But the best part wasn't the new stores or the decorations. It was the people, the diverse, vibrant community that filled the space with energy and connection. For the first time, the mall felt like it truly belonged to everyone. Monica moved through the crowd, exchanging greetings with the vendors and visitors. Everywhere she looked, there were signs of progress. A local artist had set up a gallery near the entrance, showcasing paintings that told stories of the neighborhood's history. In the food court, a group of teenagers performed a dance routine, drawing cheers and applause from the growing crowd. And at the heart of it all, Richard stood quietly near the entrance, watching the scene with a mixture of pride and humility. He had spent weeks helping with the preparations, setting up booths, coordinating with vendors, and assisting wherever he was needed. This event felt personal to him. It wasn't just about the reopening, it was about being part of something bigger, something meaningful. Monica spotted him standing there and made her way over. When she reached him, she gave him a small, warm smile. "It's a good day," she said. Richard nodded, a rare but genuine smile crossing his face. "Yeah, it really is." They stood side by side for a moment, taking in the scene. The energy was infectious. Laughter, conversation, the sound of children's joy. This was the mall they had worked so hard to create, and it was everything Monica had hoped it would be. "You've done a lot to help make this happen," Monica said, glancing at Richard. Richard shrugged modestly. "Just doing my part." Monica gave him a knowing look. "You've done more than that. I see it." Richard's smile deepened, though he kept his gaze on the bustling crowd. He didn't need recognition. Not anymore. The work itself was enough. As the day progressed, the grand reopening ceremony began. Monica took the stage, her presence calm and commanding as she addressed the crowd. She spoke not just about the mall's renovation, but about the deeper transformation that had taken place. "This mall is more than just a place to shop," she said. "It's a place for people to come together, to share their stories, their culture, and their dreams. It belongs to all of us, and it's here to serve this community." The crowd responded with applause, and Monica continued, her voice carrying warmth and sincerity. "I want to thank everyone who made this possible. The vendors, the staff, and the community. This is your space, and I can't wait to see how it grows." She paused for a moment, her gaze scanning the crowd until it landed on Richard, standing near the back. "And I want to thank someone very special, someone who's grown with this mall just as much as anyone else." Richard froze, feeling every eye turn toward him. Monica smiled warmly. "Richard, thank you for being part of this journey. Your hard work and dedication mean more than you know." The crowd erupted into applause, and Richard felt his face flush with both pride and humility. He gave a small nod, acknowledging the recognition without making a scene. This wasn't about him. It was about the people around him, the community they had built together. After Monica's speech, the celebration continued with music, dancing, and food. The mall felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. People lingered, chatting with strangers, sharing stories, and building connections. It wasn't just a reopening. It was a new beginning. As the sun began to set, the event slowly wound down, and the crowd started to thin. Vendors packed up their booths, children clutched their prizes from the day's games, and families made their way toward the exits, tired but happy. Richard stood near the entrance, watching the last of the visitors leave. Monica approached him quietly, standing by his side once again. "You did good today," she said softly. Richard nodded, his heart full. "So did you." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the mall's lights reflect off the polished floors. The day had been a success. Not just for the mall, but for everyone involved. As Monica prepared to leave, she turned to Richard one last time. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Richard smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. "Thank you," he replied, meaning it more than words could express. Monica gave him a small nod, then walked away, leaving Richard standing at the entrance, the sounds of the mall fading into the evening air. And for the first time in a long time, Richard felt like he truly belonged. This was no longer just a job. This was home. The day after the grand reopening, the mall hummed with a quieter but steady energy. Monica walked through the halls early in the morning, the soft hum of lights flickering on above her as the vendors prepared to open. There was a sense of calm now, like the first breath after a long storm. Everything was in its place exactly as it should be. She paused near the center atrium, looking around at the mall she had rebuilt, not just with bricks and paint, but with heart and intention. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments when she had doubted herself, moments when she wondered if the fight was worth it. But now, standing here in the glow of everything she had accomplished, Monica knew she had made the right choice. This mall wasn't just a business venture or a collection of stores. It was a reflection of the values she held close: community, opportunity, and belonging. It was a space where anyone could walk through the doors and feel seen, valued, and welcomed. A space that had transformed from a place of judgment and division into one of acceptance and growth. Monica's thoughts drifted back to her childhood, to the days when she walked these same halls with her mother. She remembered the longing in her mother's eyes as they window shopped for things they couldn't afford. That memory, once a source of pain, now felt like a guiding light, a reminder of how far she had come. As she stood quietly, Richard approached from a distance, his steps unhurried. He had changed too. Monica could see it in the way he carried himself, in the way he greeted everyone with genuine kindness instead of suspicion. The rigid guard who once saw the world in strict lines was gone, replaced by someone willing to learn, grow, and serve. When he reached her, they shared a brief, knowing glance. No words were needed. They both understood what this place had become and what it would continue to be. "I guess we did it," Richard said softly, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. Monica smiled. "Yeah, we did." The weight of their past interaction still lingered between them, but it no longer felt like a burden. It was part of the journey, a reminder of the mistakes they had made and the growth that followed. Richard shifted slightly, glancing around the space. "It's more than a mall now," he said thoughtfully. "Feels like something bigger." Monica nodded. "It is, and it'll keep growing, as long as we keep showing up." Richard smiled, a quiet acceptance settling into his features. "I'll keep showing up," he promised. Monica gave him a small nod of approval. "That's all I ask." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment longer, letting the calm of the morning settle over them. The mall was ready for the day ahead, and so were they. Before leaving, Monica turned to Richard one last time. "Thank you for staying," she said quietly. Richard smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "Thank you for giving me a reason to." With that, Monica offered a small parting wave and began to walk away, her footsteps light but purposeful. The sound of doors opening and vendors greeting early customers echoed softly around her, a soothing reminder that life was moving forward, just as it should. This wasn't the end of the journey. It was only the beginning of something new, something that would grow, evolve, and thrive. Monica felt certain of that. The mall had become more than just a place to shop. It was a space where people could belong, where they could learn from one another, and where they could find second chances. And as she walked toward the exit, Monica knew that the real work wasn't over. But that was okay, because now she had the right people by her side, and that made all the difference. The morning sun spilled through the glass doors, warming the floor beneath her feet. Monica stepped through the entrance with a quiet smile, the world waiting just beyond. And with that, she was gone, leaving behind a mall that no longer needed her to prove its worth. It spoke for itself now, in every smile, every connection, and every story that unfolded within its walls. This wasn't just a victory. It was a beginning. The mall's grand reopening was over, but its story was just beginning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the vibrant energy from the day's celebrations lingered in the air. Customers had left with full bags and happy hearts. Local vendors counted their first-day profits, and employees cleaned up the remnants of a day well spent. The hum of success was subtle but steady, a promise of more to come. Richard remained near the entrance, watching the last of the lights dim. His journey from rigid enforcer to humble servant had been challenging, but it had also been transformative. He had learned that redemption wasn't found in a single moment, but in the willingness to grow, to change, and to show up every day with purpose. Monica stood quietly beside him, her arms folded lightly across her chest. The two shared a glance, an unspoken acknowledgement of everything they had been through. They had started on opposite sides of a conflict but had grown into unlikely allies, bound by a shared commitment to making the mall more than it had ever been. "See you tomorrow?" Richard asked softly. Monica gave him a small smile. "Same time." With that, Richard gave a quiet nod and made his way toward the exit, his footsteps lighter than they had been in years. Monica watched him go before turning back toward the atrium one last time. She took a deep breath, the sense of accomplishment filling her with quiet pride. This wasn't just her victory. It belonged to everyone who had believed in something better. As the final lights flickered off and the mall doors closed behind her, Monica walked into the night, knowing that the future was bright. The journey had been long, but the destination had been worth it. And tomorrow, it would all begin again. The journey through this story isn't just about a security guard learning a lesson or a woman reclaiming her rightful place. It's about the deeper changes that happen when people confront their own biases. Richard thought he was just doing his job, but in truth he was guarding something much larger, his assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't. Monica's success was not just a victory over prejudice, but a statement that belonging isn't defined by appearance or status. It's a right that everyone deserves. The transformation of the mall symbolizes the power of inclusion, showing that communities thrive when we let go of old prejudices and make room for new possibilities. Through the choices Monica and Richard make, the story reminds us that it's never too late to grow. Change doesn't happen in a moment. It's a process that starts with self-awareness and continues with small, intentional steps forward. For Monica, success wasn't just owning the mall. It was building something bigger than herself, a space where everyone felt welcome and valued. Richard's journey wasn't just about redemption, but about learning to see the world with new eyes, and understanding that true strength lies in humility and service. This story challenges us to think about our own lives. How often do we judge others without knowing their full story? How many opportunities do we miss because we let assumptions guide us? Change starts with each of us, with the choice to listen, to grow, and to see beyond the surface. As Monica says, it's not about being perfect. It's about showing up every day ready to be better. So what will you do the next time you're faced with a moment like Richard's? Will you let your assumptions guide you, or will you choose to pause, listen, and make room for something new? If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring content. Let us know in the comments. What would you have done in Monica's shoes?